Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Anti-Fraud Collaboration's webcast on the impact of fraud on U.S. public companies. The Anti-Fraud Collaboration, or the AFC, is formed by 5 organizations representing the financial reporting ecosystem, including the Association for Certified Fraud Examiners, the ACFE, Center for Audit Quality, CAQ, Financial Executives International, FEI, the Institute of Internal Auditors, the IIA, and the National Association of Corporate Directors, NACD. The collaboration's mission is to enhance the effectiveness of financial fraud risk management by promoting anti-fraud policies, procedures, controls, and practices, including those enhanced or enabled by technology. Today, we are excited to share with you key findings from recently released surveys by the AFC, ACFE, and CAQ. During our discussion, we'll cover several topics, including the prevalence of fraud faced by U.S. public companies, the likelihood and significance of different types of fraud risks, various contributing factors to fraud, the current and future fraud risk environment, and mechanisms to strengthen fraud deterrence and detection. As a reminder, please answer all the polling questions today to receive CPE credit, and use the Q&A function to submit your questions. A copy of today's presentation, along with your CPE certificate, will be sent to you within 3 weeks. Now that we've covered the important housekeeping items, let's do some quick introductions. My name is Lucy Wang, and I'm the Director of Anti-Fraud Initiatives at the CAQ. In my current role, I oversee the AFC and lead the development of thought leadership and multi-stakeholder forums focused on advancing anti-fraud practices. I'll turn it over to Andy next.
Hi, everyone. I'm Andy McNeil. I'm the Chief Training Officer at the ACFE. In this role, I oversee all of our certification, education and training, and benchmarking research and thought leadership initiatives. The ACFE is a proud partner of the Anti-Fraud Collaboration, and I am thrilled to be with you all today to talk about the findings of our latest joint study.
Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Ekimoff. I'm a principal in the Forensic and Valuation Services Group at Withum Smith & Brown, PC, a national accounting and advisory firm. I am based out of Washington, D.C. and beautiful Buffalo, New York. I have spent the past 20 years as a forensic accountant and fraud investigator working with companies, boards of directors, and audit committees to help understand, report, mitigate, and even prevent fraud risk in the financial reporting process. Theo?
Good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be with you. My name is Theo Bunning. I serve as an independent director on 5 boards, 3 public company boards, 2 private company boards. I am on the audit committee of 4 of those boards, and I chair the audit committee of one of the company boards, public company boards. And again, happy to be with you today and look forward to a great conversation and discussion.
Thank you, everyone. Before we dive in, let's start with a bit of context to set up our discussion for today. Over the past year, the AFC has set out to explore the current and future state of fraud through various in-person forums and executive workshops. And as part of that initiative, we partnered with the ACFE and CAQ in launching 2 surveys with a goal of gaining an understanding of the frequency and nature of fraud occurring at U.S. public companies. These 2 surveys combined reached approximately 500 respondents, comprised of U.S. public company employees, which were mostly fraud examiners and internal auditors, also public company boards and audit committee members, external auditors, consultants and advisors, employees of government agencies, all of whom currently work for or do substantial work with one or more U.S. public company. The CAQ's Institutional Investor Survey focused on professional investors at companies managing at least $500 million in assets with a focus on the U.S. market. So Andy, let's start with you. Can you tell us what makes these surveys unique and how our audience can use its findings?
Yeah, absolutely. So The genesis for these reports actually came about a year ago at an AFC roundtable with a really interesting conversation. So we've kind of come full circle. At that event, we started talking about some other ACFE research findings, specifically the report to the nations that the ACFE puts out every 2 years. And in that study, there is a finding that certified fraud examiners estimate that the typical organization loses 5% of revenues to fraud every year. And that finding generated some fantastic discussion around what is a typical organization, what types of fraud are included, really diving into the fact that it's an incredibly broad estimate and doesn't necessarily apply to U.S. public companies. We know U.S. public companies have their own unique fraud risk landscape. Part of that is because of the types of frauds that are occurring at U.S. public companies. Part of that is because of the robust and mature anti-fraud programs a lot of U.S. public companies have. And part of that is just the sheer size. And 5% at a U.S. public company looks a lot different than 5% at a government agency or at a small business. So from that discussion, we actually decided, we worked with the AFC to conduct a follow-on study that focuses specifically on the impact of fraud at U.S. public companies. And as Lucy said, we asked some questions that we'll dive into today on a broad group of stakeholders that have insight into what fraud looks like at these organizations.
Thanks, Andy. That's really helpful context for our discussion. So before we jump into the key findings, let's kick off our first polling question. On your screen, you'll see that we've asked, what is your organization's risk tolerance for fraud losses per year? And that refers to the total amount of annual revenue lost to all forms of fraud. And the responses range from 0 tolerance for fraud, 0.5% or less, to 5% or more. It depends, or if you're not sure. So while we wait for these results, Andy, coming back to you, can you take us through the key findings on how much fraud is occurring at U.S. public companies?
Absolutely. We kind of attack this from 2 angles. We know not all fraud is known, but we also know that some organizations do capture how much fraud they're losing, or how much revenue they're losing to fraud each year. So we actually asked participants who work directly with a specific U.S. public company, whether they are an internal employee or someone in a governance role, to give us the known amount of fraud that occurred in both 2023 and 2024, as well as the revenue of that organization in both 2023 and 2024. And based on those findings, we were able to determine that the known amount of fraud at U.S. public companies during those years was just over 1% of their revenues. So that is in stark contrast to the 5% that we discussed at the previous AFC roundtable. And that gives us a good snapshot of what the known amount of fraud is at these organizations. To go along with that, though, we know that not all fraud is discovered, and when it is discovered, it's not all reported, and even when it is discovered, we may not know the full amount of loss for those schemes. So we asked all of the stakeholders in our study what they estimate the typical U.S. public company loses to fraud every year in terms of annual revenue. And you can see on the screen now that the estimates ranged based on the individual's role. We thought this was actually really interesting that those internal employees estimate that the typical public company loses 3%. Those in governance roles estimated lower at 2%. And those outside, and when we say external in this context, we mean individuals working in anti-fraud roles at government agencies that oversee U.S. public companies, or those in consulting roles primarily. But those had a higher estimate at 4%.
Great, thanks, Andy. And the CAQ has surveyed institutional investors on the same set of questions. And we have found that investors estimated that 3% of annual revenues is lost to all forms of fraud at the typical U.S. public company. Compared to the known fraud losses of about 1%, it is interesting to see that internal roles, like Andy mentioned, such as those charged with governance and employees, who are closer to anti-fraud programs or have insights into the actual amounts of fraud occurring, had estimated closer to that 1% statistic, whereas the external roles had estimated a higher percentage. So let's take a look at the poll results and see how the audience responded to these percentages of fraud losses. And again, we asked a slightly different question in the poll about what your organization's risk tolerance for fraud is as opposed to the known or estimated fraud losses. But it is interesting to see 34%, which is about 160 of the audience members, have zero tolerance for fraud. And then, it kind of teeters out to there. 5% or more was the fewest response category. So Theo, turning to you, looking at this survey and the poll results, what is your reaction or key takeaway?
Well, Lucy, I guess my initial reaction is 1%, 2%, 3% is better than 5%. But, actually it's, my reaction is somewhat mixed. I think most people look at 1% and think, that's really not a lot. But, being an accountant and a financial guy, I tend to try to put this in context with numbers. And so, in 2024, the Fortune 500 companies, which is public and private, but again, not all public companies in the US, had approximately $20 trillion in revenue. So 1% of that basically is $200 billion. And again, that's both public and private, but does not include all public companies. And so, when you think about $200 billion in lost revenue related to fraud, you kind of step back and think, does that really make sense? And, for companies that I'm serving audit committees for, I try to do similar math, having seen some of these results. And so, you think, wow, that's a lot. And I think if we are truly losing that amount of revenue to fraud, I don't think we should say, 1% looks okay.
Yeah, that's definitely good perspective. And Chris, so what are your reactions to the known and estimated fraud loss figures?
I agree with Theo in terms of how we think about that percentage point difference. If you think of a standard company having something like $10 billion in revenue, that means not only on the trillions and billions that Theo talked about, but that $10 billion company is losing $100 million a year to fraud. And imagine that headline on any executive or any corporate board. It's not going to go over well, even if it is 1% or less in terms of a numerical value. I like to think of this a couple of different ways, right? First, from an athletic background, I think about how elite professionals or elite athletes focus on the details, and that, Roger Federer is going to want to hit the tennis ball in the exact same spot on the court with every stroke. Whereas someone who's less well skilled at tennis, I don't know, say Chris Ekimoff here, I'm just going to try to hit the ball over the net, right? So if Roger Federer misses by 1%, that's a big deal, right? He is the best of the best, or up until he retired. Chris Ekimoff is not and will not be the best of the best. So that 1% means something different to me. We're talking about US public companies, right? That 1% is probably much closer to that elite idea of Roger Federer than it is related to me just trying to hit a tennis ball back to my older brother. So, that focus on the quantitative value of that percentage point, yes, to Theo's point, 1 is better than 5, but to Roger Federer, that 1% is still an issue. And for those companies who may be on the call today thinking about, wow, if I'm losing 1%, that's X dollars. It is not always that classic case of a trusted financial reporting professional writing checks to themselves that add up to 1% of top line revenue. There are a variety of ways in which fraud can be understood or measured in this context. We think about things like time theft or inefficiencies in processes that lead to waste. Those types of things may be little instances of fraud issue that can lead to that classic kind of death by 1,000 cuts idea of a enterprise operating normally is inherently exposed to fraud risk, and some of that fraud may be effectuated through these less detectable instances along the way. And then finally, I don't know if we have any psychometricians on the webinar today. That's those people who study surveys and studies. But we're asking individuals to self-report in both of these surveys their perceptions. So each individual respondent may have a different discussion of fraud, different idea about fraud. Someone like Theo or myself with a CPA background and a compliance focus may think any violation of company policy is fraud, whereas someone in a more aggressive sales posture may only see those more egregious violations being labeled as fraudulent. So those types of ideas really work in here as well. But one concept that I'd like all of you to take away today in your work in-house with companies as internal auditors, with your consultative positions, helping businesses outside of that, is really to think about the NIMBY movement, that being related to real estate and kind of the common public services perception of people love to hear about growth and development, but they like to say, not in my backyard, right? NIMBY. I don't want to bring that to my neighborhood. I don't want that new opportunity around where I live or where I work. I think from a fraud perspective, in the hundreds of clients I've worked with in the past 20 years, or even in dealing with some of the folks who are participating in developing a lot of these surveys, we get responses from folks who say, sure, fraud is happening, but not in my organization. And so I'd like everyone to think about that phrase, NIMO, not in my organization, as NEMO, right? Who in your professional lives is approaching fraud risk with that NEMO attitude of, yeah, I just read that headline about that other business, or of course, I just read that survey result, but that's not actually what's happening in my organization. I would challenge you to have a conversation with them about how fraud is prevalent. It is a part of the way these businesses operate and should be measured appropriately as we think about how to improve upon that.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Chris. And as a tennis enthusiast, I certainly appreciated the Federer analogy.
An enthusiast, but not skilled in any respect.
Right. I'm in
my
the
neck
Chris
gets tired just
Ekimoff
watching
pocket.
go back and forth.
Exactly. So, and that brings up a great point. We kind of talk about the known and estimated fraud losses. And now as we move on to what types of fraud are occurring at U.S. public companies, let's first turn to our second poll question, which we'd like to ask the audience to consider which of the following types of fraud is top of mind at you or your clients' organizations. And there's a range of fraud risks here, ranging from asset misappropriation, embezzlement, bribery, and corruption. I think one of the questions we received is, were losses attributable to cybersecurity included as fraud? Cyber fraud is certainly a significant issue. And when we asked respondents about all forms of fraud, we certainly would consider that as one of them as well. So as we wait on those results, Andy, what did the survey tell us about the likelihood and significance of the different types of fraud risks?
Right. Well, I mean, that question kind of teed this up, right? Not only is cyber fraud included, it's the biggest risk. And that's not too surprising, especially when we're thinking of these losses. We know that organizations see this as we hear it as a top board priority. We know the amount of internal resources that are getting dedicated to cybersecurity training and protocols. So we asked our respondents to give us some insight into what risks they see as most likely and what risks they see as most significant within their fraud risk index at their organizations or at U.S. public companies in general. And what we saw was really interesting, I thought, and that is those risks on the right side in the white text, cyber fraud, fraud by vendors and sellers, fraud by customers, those are all external risk vectors, and those are the most likely ones, according to our respondents. The internal fraud risks, that sort of holy trinity of occupational fraud that we've heard about for so very long, financial statement fraud, bribery and corruption, and asset misappropriation or embezzlement, those are less likely to happen. That's what a lot of our programs are focused on. And what we've seen is this slight shift from both internal focus, but also the risk vectors from the internal frauds to the external frauds over the last while in terms of doing our fraud risk assessment. So when we're talking about the overall fraud risk landscape, we are looking at every form of fraud, and because I think organizations need to be paying attention to all of the different ways that fraud can attack them.
Yes, certainly agreed. Thank you, Andy. And in terms of the responses by investors, I find this type of visual very helpful, since we have heard from so many stakeholders on how important it is for companies to define the types of fraud risks that are most relevant to them based on their business operations and unique risk profile. The results from investors were fairly consistent in the sense that external frauds, like Andy mentioned, such as cyber, customer payment fraud, and fraud by vendors and sellers, were the highest probable risk areas, and investors viewed financial statement fraud and asset misappropriation as slightly higher probable and significant risk areas, relatively speaking. But one interesting outlier to point out is that bribery and corruption, which was perceived as a pretty remote and almost inconsequential risk factor. And these surveys were in the field this March and April of 2025. So let's take a quick look at the poll results and see where these fraud risks fall amongst the audience's priorities. Yes, cyber fraud, all of the above seem to be pretty highly selected. Asset misappropriation and embezzlement came in second, and the rest were about even, which is pretty interesting. So Chris, going to you, how should companies assess and respond to these risks based on their significance and likelihood?
I'd like to go back to the first polling question results in our minds and think about what the participants in this webinar said, right? The overall leader in that group, I think, was 37-ish% related to zero tolerance for fraud. The second highest response from all of you participating was, we're not sure what our company or our business's tolerance for fraud is. That's a different idea, right, in terms of how we would think about fraud risk internally, and one we need an answer for. And one of the easiest ways to consider an answer to that is a common practice in the industry that those CFEs on the call, as well as those active in the anti-fraud arena, know as a fraud risk assessment, right? It is a standardized process in which we understand the operations of the organization, the touch points they have internally and externally with stakeholders, employees, contacts, vendors, and they get a good sense of where fraud risk may exist. Now, that existence, that perception of fraud risk is what starts us on a path to understand, are we controlling for and mitigating fraud risk as best as possible with the resources we have and the landscape of opportunities that are in front of us. That plan, although it sounds relatively straightforward, is so important to write down and to quantify and to prioritize so that your organizations have a meaningful, defensible, and strategic response to fraud risk that can be a North Star in all of these, what I think, Theo, Andy, and Lucy were conveying to you, is a very scary set of ideas. So I definitely encourage, if you're a part of an organization in internal audit or in the enterprise risk function, and you haven't recently conducted a fraud risk assessment, definitely consider how to get more involved in that process, because that's really going to start to put pen to paper on where you as an organization or you as a professional might fall on these heat maps of responses that we've got from the survey. And as we think about it, it's important to consider certain types of fraud, like cyber fraud, that can be very well understood, or something scary that maybe we don't have a good handle on right now as it relates to financial reporting, right? One of the things we're talking about today. Cyber fraud is known to happen regularly, right? You may get those email updates from your IT department telling you we've recently, staved off 7,422 external attacks today. Those numbers always blow my mind. But also thinking about those non-traditional or not as well publicized issues from a financial reporting perspective. That's really where I think that prioritization and that assessment can be helpful.
Yeah, definitely helpful to consider, Chris. And Theo, what stood out to you the most about these results? And, do you have any thoughts on what the maximum frauds attributed to are these days? Happy to get your thoughts.
Sure. First, it's interesting as I saw the two slides. The one that jumps out to me, and I'll talk about a number of these actually, bribery and corruption was a surprise to me in terms of significance. Typically from where I sit, on boards, when that's an issue, it can be catastrophic. It's a brand challenge, it's a brand issue. And so generally the fallout from bribery and corruption, I would view as maybe, more significant than maybe what others have indicated in the survey. What's also interesting to me as an audit committee chair is, kind of take solace in the fact that, and maybe kind of really reiterating some of the points Andy made, that the external fraud items are the one that tend to be more to the right and to the top, which to me kind of says, the things that companies have focused on, the things that audit committees generally have focused on historically in terms of financial reporting, in terms of internal controls, in terms of, ethics compliance programs, are those things where we see, they tend to be more down and to the left, which says, yeah, I think those programs have really been effective, and those focus areas have been effective. But also, I think as you see what now is starting to occupy more time in audit committee meetings is cybersecurity, third-party risk management, basically the external items. And as you can tell, I think a lot of folks see those as risk areas from a fraud perspective that, quite frankly, justifies that focus. And the question that was raised about cyber, I think, was an interesting one too, because I think it's top of mind for a lot of us. So so I think what we see, quite frankly, in survey results tend to line up with past focus, current focus of audit committees. And for me, actually, I take some solace in the fact that sitting on audit committees, I think we are focused on the things that fundamentally folks believe should be getting a heightened level of focus. So again, I think the survey results kind of line up with what we see. It would be interesting to me also, I think, if we do this survey again in the next year or so, how are people thinking about AI? Because AI is starting to become really a topic of conversation for audit committee members. And I think also it ties into, quite frankly, the cyber fraud area. And I think some folks see AI, potentially as a positive and a negative as it relates to fraud. It could maybe help in terms of mitigating fraud, but I think in the wrong hands, it obviously increases the risk of fraud.
Yeah, thank you, Theo. Very comprehensive take on this. And to kind of round out this section, we kind of covered the different types of fraud losses that were reported, and also the fraud risk that can be considered and what their likelihood and significance is. We, got a question, maybe I'll direct it to you, Andy, in terms of, so contextualizing the percentages and the estimates and even the known fraud losses. If the perception of fraud is, let's say, 3% or even higher, does that mean 3% of the $20 trillion of Fortune 500 companies are lost to frauds every year? How can we kind of right size these figures or contextualize them?
Yeah, I think that's kind of the challenge for all of us, especially those in the anti-fraud profession, right? Is to understand what does that mean for the organizations that we work with. And I think a couple points are helpful. One is one that Chris has actually made in some of our prior conversations around this study, which is remembering that for a lot of organizations, it's not just one big fraud that is going to make the headlines. Some of this is what he called death by 1,000 cuts, which I think is a really good way to look at it. You may have more than one fraud occurring at any given time. And when you accumulate all of those losses, especially those cyber risks, over time, that may be contributing to the higher level of fraud rather than it being one single headline making scandal. That does happen, but that's obviously in the minority. And to Theo's point, it's not even going to be necessarily the financial reporting scandals of days yore. It will be things from a vendor or a customer attacking the organization, which is less of a scandal, right? Ideally, you've got your fraud programs robust enough to catch those, prevent them, stop them before they cause those high losses. But it's not the same as an executive basically fleecing the organization out of 3% of its revenues. So I think it's important to remember we're not just talking about one giant governance scandal, headline making fraud. There are multiple vectors that we're looking at here. It's also important to remember that the estimates were that typical organization. And again, that is a loaded word. We asked the typical US public company in all forms of fraud. And that's how we landed that 2, 3, 4% estimates. To Chris's other point, there's a lot of people that if you ask, what about your organization? They'd say, oh, no, mine is much, much lower than that, right? Somebody else's problem, but we're really good here. So it's not necessarily saying that every organization is absolutely losing 3%, 2% of revenues to fraud every year. But we did see actual data showing known fraud losses at 1%, which is, I think, enough to go back and do the fraud risk assessments and make sure that fraud programs are sound to make sure that your organization is not one of the ones that is in that category.
Yeah, just to jump in too, I think one other way to consider that amount or that idea is the first 25 pages of every 10K and 10Q. Theo, I know you guys like you and me will read these because we love it. I don't know how many others on this call are reading 10Ks in their free time, but talking about the risks that any public company is facing, they're going to mention a variety of different things in that discussion of risks facing the organization, and fraud is likely going to be one of them. It is a known occurrence, but maybe not a quantifiable one in the same way that issues with certain collaborators with vendors or customers may arise and be risky, and regulatory risk and environmental risks for operations as well. So although the F word gets a lot of attention and it's something that's covered in the news media significantly, I would also think of it through that lens of being a known risk environment or known risk area that each company is considering. And that's probably where we get closer to that 1% on the whole as an average.
Thank you, Chris. Yes, that's a great way to put these findings into perspective. Now that we've discussed how the risk and as percentages may be perceived, let's talk about what's driving or contributing to fraud. Andy, what were some of the key contributing factors to fraud from the survey?
To help us really understand, the why, right? That's a big piece of all this. We can talk about those percentages all day, but if we don't really understand the why behind them, it's going to make it really hard for us to know where to go with them. So part of our survey, we asked respondents to rank a list of 10 factors that we provided them in terms of how much they contribute to current levels of fraud risk. And we looked at them by their answers by different roles. And before I dive in, I do want to mention, we left it up to the respondents to interpret whether these factors were contributing positively or negatively. We did not include that in the question, which I think maybe gave us some really interesting results here. If you remember back earlier on, employees were estimating a higher level of fraud than those in governance roles, for example. And then when we get here and look at what factors are contributing, we see a very stark contrast between what employees say is contributing to the current level of fraud versus what those in governance roles think are contributing to the current level of fraud. And that was fascinating to us as we dove into this data. So, if you're looking at these from an employee perspective, they're really thinking the most significant, and this was interesting, the regulatory environment. Our employees, those that are on the front lines, are thinking that regulations, the economic environment, and the overall tone at the top are the top 3 factors that affect how much fraud is occurring at organizations. Now, does that mean that those things are making the fraud higher or lower? That was left up to the participant. But then we look over at the governance roles, and they put quality of external audits at the top. And, part of what I'm curious there, and Theo, I'm sure you and I could probably talk for about 3 days on this, is does that mean that they think those external audits are doing a great job and that they can rely on those to keep the fraud level down? Or does that mean that they have a concern that the quality of external audits might not be high enough to catch the fraud that they might be concerned about? They estimated a lower percentage as being lost to fraud. So I'd like to think it's that they feel some level of confidence in the audits, but I think that would be an interesting point to dive into maybe in a future study.
Great, thank you. And in the CAQ's investor survey, the respondents had ranked each of the factors based on how much they contributed to the current levels of fraud at the U.S. public companies. So the top 3 most frequently rated factors were technological advancements, quality of external audits, and economic conditions and environment. Theo, going to you first, how do you interpret these factors from the different roles?
Yeah, it's interesting, Lucy, and I've scratched my head at this slide for many times and probably more time than I'd like to actually confess to folks on the in the webinar. It's interesting to me. I mean, I really, for me, it's good to see the employee responses. I'll look at that first, because when I think about those and those factors, those are generally things that really align with the roles and responsibilities of employees. And so to see that employees view those factors as most important for me actually makes me feel pretty good about most programs that you see across companies. It was also good to see that employees don't view the quality of external audits as that important, because where I said in terms of on audit committees, we talk a lot about our lines of defense as it relates to controls as well as fraud prevention. And the employees really kind of become that first line. Your auditors aren't necessarily, you never want them to be your first line of defense. I've often said, if it, if fraud, if it's up to external auditors to detect fraud, we've got bigger problems. That means, our lines of defense are failing, along the way. And so again, I think it was great to see employees, I think, owning the responsibility to some extent in their role for, managing fraud risk. Getting back to Andy's comment about, governance, I can answer that question from my perspective as an audit committee member, audit committee chair. I mean, the quality of the external audit, I view as more of as a positive. And again, I think if you look at roles and responsibilities, I think to some extent that is how the respondents, I think, maybe saw these as more significant or less significant. I think if you're sitting on a board from a governance perspective, you engage with the external audit, the external auditors. And so I think that really kind of comes out as something that you fundamentally view as a factor. And I think it's a positive factor, quite frankly, in terms of how most board members, audit committee members would think about it. And again, when you get to your external responses, I think when you think about roles and responsibilities and line of sight, I think most external folks quickly think about the economic conditions and the environment having an influence on employees and what people may do or not do as it relates to when they're under pressure. And it's also a good one for me from an external response perspective was the organization culture and tone at the top, which also somewhat aligns with the employees, because I think that is very critical in terms of, how fraud is managed within an organization, because if you don't have the tone at the top, it becomes really difficult for your organization more broadly to line up and accept that responsibility for fraud detection and fraud prevention. So again, it's, as you look at this, sometimes I think it's a head scratcher, but I think the more we dove into this and had conversations around this, for me, it actually starts to make a lot of sense.
Great, thank you, Theo. And Chris, what is your take on these contributing factors from a roles perspective?
Yeah, I totally agree with Theo, and we don't always agree. So if everyone's only got an hour of exposure to me and Theo, we don't just say yes to each other all the time. But I think of it too, that roles and responsibility is really what are each of these groups thinking about on a regular basis? If I'm a line worker at a pharmaceutical company helping make highly regulated pharmaceutical products, drugs that people need to feel better and improve their health situation, I have so much paperwork and so many processes that I need to follow because most likely it's the law, right? To make this thing that someone's going to put in their body that's going to follow all these medical regulations. That regulatory environment for me, that's the employee I think of, right? Is someone standing on the line, packaging the pill and following the 39 steps that it takes to move the pill from the conveyor belt to the bottle, right? No one could imagine what those 39 steps are unless you eat, sleep, and breathe it that way. That individual is not dealing with the auditors, right? They're not thinking about, quarterly results or whether or not the EBITDA is being represented appropriately. They're just worried about following the rules. And then to Theo's point, flipping that back on the other side, if you're sitting on the board or the audit committee, who are you interacting with the most? Management and the external auditors, right? To understand if things are going well on the financial reporting side. The thing that sticks with me too from the external responses, and this is probably just from being a girl dad of a 2-year-old, I think of the movie Frozen, right? The economic conditions and environment there were going well in Arendelle for a while until they changed. And until that leadership at the top of the kingdom, follow me along here, starts to get a strong tone and a strong structure, they're out in the cold there. And that external responses side of it, looking to, 3 of the top 6 answers are nothing that the organization has control over. Economic conditions, external pressures, and the regulatory environment, right? The business is subject to those issues, similar to how Arendelle is subject to the winds of the weather. Having those things in place, as Theo talked about, that culture to combat that effective governance, that to me is really kind of the interplay between what exposes more fraud risk and how we control for it.
Well, following right on there, though, I found the other side of the external responses list kind of interesting too, that they ranked the anti-fraud program at the very bottom.
Right.
saying how mature that program is, it's not really that important to us through that external lens. So that stuck out to me as well.
Maybe that's the third of the respondents we had before who
It might
don't
be.
know what the fraud risk profile is of their organization.
Exactly.
I was gonna say exactly too. Definitely interesting to see the differences between each of the roles and their perspectives in this survey. So we will dive into roles even further. So let's turn to our next poll before we talk about who is responsible for fraud. And the poll question is, who is primarily responsible for anti-fraud programs at you and your clients' organizations, regardless of whether how effective or important you view them? And so, Andy, who is responsible?
Well, I mean, the answer is always everyone, but but I think the audience probably knows that. But when we dive into the findings, we saw the internal audit and compliance are the teams that are most commonly tasked with owning the anti-fraud program holistically. More than that, though, almost 3/4 of the organizations, it's owned by multiple departments, which makes sense. We know that fighting fraud is a multidisciplinary exercise. It requires a lot of teams working together and collaborating. And frankly, that ties to a lot of what we hear at ACFE, which is the most successful fraud programs are owned and managed by stakeholders in multiple functions, collaborating strongly to make sure it's a holistic, comprehensive program rather than siloed into one specific team.
Yeah, and from the investor perspective, 62% of respondents ranked internal audit teams as either first, second, or third most responsible for preventing and detecting fraud within the companies, followed by company management, the board, and external auditors. And we had asked an extra question. However, when fraud occurs, 41% of investors view the company's senior management as most responsible. So let's see what the poll results were in terms of where fraud sits within the organizations. And it seems to be, internal audit and compliance as the top responses, followed by risk, legal, and then corporate security and others and investigations. So that's interesting. And Chris, what does this tell you about the ownership and responsibility of fraud at public companies?
Well, first off, it gives me a little bit of a headache because I don't think that those percentages added up to 100%. And as a certified public accountant, that just bothers me. But in this case, it's a good result, right? Andy talked about the best position to be in from a fraud risk perspective is to have as many legs under the table as possible. I like to think of the old caveat, what gets measured is what matters, right? If a business is focused solely on, inventory valuations, because that's a big part of their business, everybody's going to know we need to be sure our inventory value is right. Or if it's a very sales ordered organization, they're going to have to focus on their sales quotas. And everyone at the organization, even the lowliest front desk admin all the way up to the CEO is going to think about sales. I like to think about that from a fraud perspective. Well, is that if you can get your entire organization to consider or talk about fraud, you're in a better position to understand where the risks are and what might happen. So sure, at some point, the buck is going to stop with the chief audit executive or the chief risk officer or the general counsel, with however your organization might be defined. But the better that awareness and communication can be shared across diverse departments and each of them knowing where their role might be. Also, if you think of the largest Fortune 500 companies, Theo, we were talking about earlier, their industries are wildly different, right? A fraud program at a financial institution, at a bank, at someone dealing with payments processing is going to mean something a lot different than that pharmaceutical manufacturer or a professional services firm, and how fraud would align with each of those. So a home building company may look a lot more at the receiving of raw materials as they look at the gypsum board or the wood that comes in than, say, a bank does about their raw materials, if you will. They'll be looking much more at interactions with customer deposits or loan applications or things like that. So I think in each of those cases, right, you can imagine in that bank, you're going to have a lot more systematized responses to the customer and depositor interactions. Probably something on the legal side will be the leader in that fraud risk area. Where on the home builder side, maybe it's more related to procurement or operations that own fraud, because they're going to be able to look at the gypsum board and decide, is it thick enough? Is it made with the right quality? It's a couple of ways to consider where it's owned.
Yeah, definitely. And Theo, what are your thoughts? Do these results surprise you?
Yeah, somewhat. Actually, it was a pleasant surprise. I was glad to see that the external auditors didn't show up, given some of our previous comments and conversation as it relates to, kind of the factors that contribute. So again, I think that was really that was a pleasant surprise. The other item, the other area that I'm surprised didn't show up, and maybe it's somewhat inherent in this, and it goes back to kind of the investors slide on kind of who's responsible when fraud happens. Their number one item was senior management. And so I think when you talk about responsibility, as Andy has said, I think it is responsibility of all folks in an organization, but I think it's even more so the responsibility of management when you think about anti-fraud programs. And so if you're kind of responsible when something bad happens, then I think you have to have that responsibility and carry that responsibility to prevent and detect it as well. And so I think it's critical that senior management, it's critical that you have the appropriate tone at the top when you talk about, who's responsible for fraud and fraud programs. I think, organizations we saw that even came through on the poll today, internal audit, compliance, those functions, those are the groups, quite frankly, that I think generally have kind of that internal oversight of these programs. But what really makes, I think, an anti-fraud program work is getting buy-in from senior management, as well as having buy-in from all employees and understanding the importance and criticality of having a robust program, and having a strong kind of ethical program as well within the context of the company.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Theo. And before we move on to the next section, we can address one of the questions that came in on what specific cultural indicators should leadership monitor to detect early signs of fraud vulnerability. Chris, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's no silver bullet here. Each organization is going to need to consider where culture plays a role or what to look for. As a practicing fraud investigator, right, I'm sure many of you who are CFEs know about anomaly detection in terms of looking at the data that's being provided internally at an organization and trying to find where the bumps are a little bit too high or a little bit too low. That can often be an indicator of cultural activity. I like to think of it too as a centralization metric. When we think about how individuals inside an organization are operating, we all know that guy who has the best sales probably is a little bit more laissez-faire with his expense reports than the rest of the team. That type of activity can permeate, right? And maybe the next person in line also has great sales, and so their expense reports aren't as looked at as closely then. But that might influence how everyone else does their expense reports, right? And so those folks who don't have a sales position that would justify, going on all of these trips to meet the right potential clients or developers, you can start to see where those cultural cracks fit in. So I would think about kind of those cohorts of activity as well as a cultural indicator to say, where might there be activity that we need to kind of stamp out before it gets too big? And then as well, as talked about from the ACFE perspective, there's a lot of analytics and tools that can be plugged into every organization that can identify that extra 2% at the top that are way out of line with expectations as a place to potentially go look for issues around fraud.
Lucy, I'd maybe give us some additional commentary on that. I think, from an audit committee board perspective, I think some of the things we look at as it relates to, ethics hotline reporting and the types of reports that are coming out of that, and because that starts to give you some insight into really kind of, what's going on in the company, the culture of companies. I mean, one of the conversations I've been having a lot within chief audit executives, internal audit executives is, help me better understand the culture of the company as you go about doing your work as the internal audit and the internal audit function. Because I think understanding the culture, better understanding why people, do what they do, and help you get a better appreciation for the effectiveness, I think, of your ethics programs, and also, I think can be sometimes leading indicators of things that might be kind of happening just under the covers to some extent. So, having those conversations with your internal audit group, what are they seeing when they're out going about doing their work, as well as focusing on, what is coming out of your your compliance programs and your ethics reporting and your hotline, I think is also a good way to try to get a feel for, how is the organization? What is the strength? How are people adopting kind of your points of view around, hey, we're going to do, doing the right thing, and our employees actually engaging in that.
I think I would add one thing to that, and it's really, Theo, spot on with what you were saying, but as we're looking at that culture and we're looking in those hot spots, the hotline is only as effective as people are willing to use it. And I think when we're thinking about cultural indicators of potential fraud risk, I think low trust environments really speak to the fact that some people might not feel comfortable coming forward if they have concerns. So while those lines of defense are active, while they're looking at the culture, while they're looking not just at the tone at the top, but at the mood in the middle and the buzz at the bottom, identifying areas where people might not feel comfortable speaking up, they might feel like their values are out of alignment, or there might be some other reason that they wouldn't feel comfortable bringing forward information. We know that tips are the top way frauds are detected, but if those tips aren't coming forward, we're probably going to miss a whole lot of frauds.
And thank you, Andy. That's super helpful, because we did have another question on tips, and I feel like that kind of addresses it a little bit, and we will talk more about that as we continue on with our discussion. Now we'll look ahead into the current and future fraud risk landscape. So let's pull up our next poll question. We like to ask the audience, how do you expect the overall level of fraud at U.S. public companies to change over the next 2 years, from decreasing significantly to increasing significantly? Andy, going back to you, how does the current and future fraud risk landscape look based on the survey results?
I would say this looks like I was expecting it to look. We've got about more than half see the current level of fraud as at least material, with another almost 20% as extremely material. So only 28% aren't really thinking it's a considerable risk for U.S. public companies. And then at that very bottom, we've got those, what did you call them, Nemos, Chris? The not at my organizations, that 1%. I also look at those as maybe future headline makers, because we know that the companies that aren't paying attention tend to be the most at risk for large problems. So this is pretty much in line with what I think we were expecting to see, which is it's good to see a lot of organizations paying attention. And as we look ahead, it does look like individuals that participated in our survey are expecting it to increase. And that's actually not too surprising either. We know that times of uncertainty, it tends to be a breeding ground for fraud, and at least for fraud risk, if our programs aren't strong enough to stop it. So 66% expect fraud to increase over the coming 2 years. There's a lot of factors that might be behind that, whether it's technology, geopolitical uncertainty, general economic and financial concerns, ethical erosion in some organizations. There's a lot of things that might be feeding that. So curious what Chris and Theo their take on that is.
Yes, and totally agree. I think the investors shared a very similar view of the current levels of fraud, with a medium to high overall level of fraud at the public companies. And just over half of investor respondents believe that the level of fraud will increase slightly or significantly in the near future. So as we turn to Chris, let's also cue for the polling results and see how the audience view what the level of fraud will be in the future. And so, yeah, let's do a quick math here, but 65%.
I think it's close.
Yeah. Pretty good.
Exactly, very similar results. So Chris, what are you focused on, or your clients should be focused on, when thinking about the levels of fraud in the current and future?
It's not going anywhere, right? And I think the one thing that I always come back to is, a world of limited resources. For those of you who deal with businesses that are regulated through the federal or state governments around the U.S. right now, that resource management for investigations and enforcement is changing. And so being cognizant that someone else is not going to catch the fraud for you, really means you have to put the onus on yourself to get there, both in today's environment and, in my mind, in the future.
Great. And Theo, how about you? Any words of advice?
Yeah, as I look at the results, I mean, my thoughts really I don't think differ significantly from the internal poll that was done by the folks on the call today, as well as kind of investors and others. And so, it is something that I think about a lot, quite frankly, with the role that I have, and I think about it maybe through two, three, I don't know, maybe four lenses. Technology advancements, I think, is what comes to top of mind for most folks when they think about fraud levels changing. And, I think some people think technological changes may actually help in terms of identifying and preventing fraud. I think the flip side of that is technological changes can also be an area that could actually increase fraud risk. When I look at, the remote work environment today, and I know we're transitioning through this to some extent, but more remote work environments for me generally mean, are we? It makes accountability more difficult, and I think in any case where accountability becomes more difficult, I think it kind of enhances the opportunity for fraud. Again, when we go back to some of our other data, and the vectors, when you think of third party risk, I mean, today, so many companies have outsourcing operations and they rely on third parties for, more and more as it relates to the percentages of the work that gets done. And third party risk, I think, will continue to increase. And then even in audit committee meetings now, we starting to have conversations around fourth party risk, third party risk to our third parties, so to speak. And so, I think that, and then one for me that I spend a lot of time thinking about, quite frankly, is what I call kind of, human behaviors and kind of what's socially acceptable, from a human behavior perspective. And, I personally, I think I see that changing. And so how will that find its way back into a corporate environment, and will it find its way back into a corporate environment? And I know, we do a lot of work to, quite frankly, reinforce with employees, you want to do the right thing, how important it is to do the right thing. But, do they see a contrast within the corporate environment versus maybe what they, see outside of that? And so again, I think there are a number of different areas that I think about that, for me, I think it's more likely that we'll see increases in fraud risk as opposed to decreases.
Great. Thank you so much for that. And especially since a question came in about third parties, so it was hopefully address that one. And to round out our discussion today, we wanted to end on, what can companies do to strengthen fraud prevention and detection, which also brings us to our final poll question and key takeaways from each of our speakers today. Here is a list of things that companies can do or prioritize. And, we did have a couple questions about what is AI's role in fraud prevention and detection? What about the regulatory environment? I feel like Chris did address some of that as well. And the last question we received was, Theo and Chris, what's been happening in your field that has been happening perhaps related to PPP loans, mortgage industry. There's a lot of external factors that people should consider. So perhaps we can pull up the results as well if they're through, and then start with Andy. Let's run through the last couple of slides together.
Yeah, absolutely. Theo kind of teed us up perfectly for this. We did ask how those in internal roles thought their organizations could do better in terms of preventing and detecting fraud. And more than half said we got to get better at actually watching for it more proactively and more real time. And that's not too surprising. I think Theo kind of mentioned this earlier. If we're waiting for the external auditors to catch it, we've lost the war. So being really proactive, making sure we're getting out in front of it. But then the other two to most common responses, which were dwarfed, but they're still important. Really, they're the 2 points that Theo just made, and to me, they're the how we're going to get better at it. One is using technology, AI, those tools that Chris mentioned earlier to make sure we're monitoring both behavioral and transactional anomalies. But the other is the human element. Are we training our people? Are we building the trust? What's our culture? How openly are we talking about fraud risk? How much are we getting our employees invested in being our front line against potential fraud risk?
Definitely. And I feel like that is fairly in line with the investors' perspectives as well. The top 3 categories for strengthening fraud prevention and detection included proactive and continuously monitoring for fraud, improvements to organizational culture and the trust that Andy mentioned, and also enhanced efforts related to whistleblower reporting and protection, which is always key for fraud detection and deterrence. So if the poll results are ready, we can pull that up, and then we'll just spend the 1 more minute or 2 on key takeaways from Chris. What is an area that stands out to you?
I mean, again, I'm looking at a poll that has more than 100% of percentage points, so my head's exploding again. I think, that conversation across all the different legs under the table is going to continue to be relevant, whether you have a huge fraud risk management budget and all the technological bells and whistles you can have, or if it's a smaller organization or someone who's not been empowered to go outside to find those issues. I think that acknowledgement of that is something that the CAQ and the ACFE and the anti-fraud collaboration, FEI and IAA all do a very good job of, and we just need to keep shouting that message out into the world. I think that's going to continue to help build on what we've done here. We've got a question I think is fun from an anonymous attendee asking about the whistleblower hotline. That to me is just the perfect marriage of 2 ideas. How do you overcome that question of trust? That's really to Theo's
That's a
point
whole other
earlier.
webinar.
Exactly right. That'll take us it's a 2-day working session, with Andy specifically. But that to me is one of the great questions that are out there that folks like Theo and in the management perspective really focus on regularly. So I'll leave that to him. But for me, right, that building of awareness, that tapping into the best way that your organization can use its resources to think about fraud risk starts with a meaningful assessment and a strategic way to view those issues. Theo?
Yeah, I'll make this very quick because I'll just reiterate things that I've said already. But for me, it's organizational culture, tone at the top. Tone at the top, not just from management, but I think from your board of directors. It's about creating trust. How much trust does your organization foster? And so you've got to really lean into the communications piece of this. And while I know we talk a lot about technology for me, AI is a tool. It's human behaviors and communications and culture that's going to drive how people use these tools. And so I think at the end of the day, organizational culture is critical when you talk about effective fraud prevention and detection.
Thank you all so much. And that is all the time that we have today. Thank you again to our speakers and everyone in the audience for joining us. We look forward to seeing you at another anti-fraud collaboration event soon. Have a great day.